Welcome back to the Elias Macko Show and the third hour of the program. Now, calls are growing louder across Europe, across the world, about how governments and regulators are moving too far in restricting speech, online speech, and media. There's a debate over how far authorities should go in policing content and quote-unquote illegal posts. Some people receiving jail time for posts on social media. And then we can talk about regulatory stuff as well. Punishments like heavy fines against major social media platforms in Europe under their European Union Digital Services Act. Some argue these policies cross the line into censorship, could reshape what people can see and say online. Let's go to Sarah McLaughlin now, a senior scholar for global expression with the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, also known as FIRE. Sarah, welcome to this program.
Hi, thanks for having me on the show.
So Sarah, I see stuff on social media and I almost feel, okay, it's the algorithms. They're showing me all this content. It can't possibly be true. When I see a story from Europe about someone who says something and then is in jail for what I would sometimes think is more of a benign post. But then I read a piece by one of your colleagues, Greg Lukianoff, someone who's been on CJAD before, and he wrote a piece that said the situation for free speech in Europe is even worse than I thought. And I said to myself, okay, it's not the social media algorithms. Something's up. Sarah, what's happening in Europe?
Yeah, well, Greg is absolutely right in that piece. What's happening in Europe is that there has become way too much comfort among people with the idea that the government has a role in policing offense. And not just, disagreeing with it or saying, we don't like this speech, but actually going to people's doors and arresting them. One of the worst places it's been for this recently has been the UK, where, they're going to the doors of thousands of people each year to say, quite literally, someone was offended by something you tweeted on social media. And, the UK has even had something called non-criminal hate incidents, where you can have the police show up at your door for something that is legal speech that the government cannot punish, just so they can interrogate you about what you said on the internet because someone somewhere who you may not even know who complained about you said they didn't like what you posted on the internet. And that's not the way to operate a free society. You cannot have public discourse that way.
So, I think from North America, again, I go back to, I just can't believe it's actually happening. You know what I mean? Like, I don't, maybe it's because I don't want to believe it, right? Do you have examples? Like the UK, I'm seeing stuff about people posting memes and getting these visits. Like maybe one or two examples for our audience, concrete examples would just show what the extent is of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there was a very high-profile example that I think caught a lot of people's attention, which was the Graham Linehan case, who's the comedy writer who had been living in the U.S. for a while. He tweeted something, critical of trans people. And then he flew to the UK, and there were police waiting for him when he landed. So there has been a lot of arrests about speech about gender, but also about Israeli-Palestinian conflict. People who have posted things, perhaps with some curse words that I won't say on the radio, but about Hamas. They've had police showing up at their door. So it's been, you could probably guess what some of the issues have been about because it's what people find controversial: gender, race, migration, immigration, Israel, Hamas. And it's not even just, one point of view. There's been a lot of this from, pro-Palestinian speech too. So it's kind of across the board. Essentially, if you're saying something that people might find offensive, you might hear a knock on the door.
Knock on the door, is there also jail time? Because I'm trying to go from the stuff I see on social media, and maybe it's because I'm on X. And boy, does Elon Musk love talking about this subject. So I see these stories all the time. But does it lead from the door knock to, hey, you're going to have to spend some time in prison over a post?
Yeah, in some cases, in the UK, there's something called the Malicious Communications Act. And so that essentially says that if you say something that causes anxiety or distress to another person, yes, you can ultimately end up spending a few months in jail. There have been cases in Finland, France, Germany. There was, this caught a lot of attention in the US recently, but there was coverage of in Germany, how they are essentially conducting middle of the night raids on people, sometimes just for tweets about politicians. And that's kind of an especially shocking thing for a lot of people. This idea that politicians get special protection from criticism, when I think the conventional wisdom and the right wisdom would be politicians should expect more criticism, expect more debate, because they're the ones with power to, set laws to control people's lives.
And what are everyday citizens saying about this? And I guess, is there a chilling effect where someone who is not happy about door knocking for social media posts is worried that if they voice their opinion on just being unhappy about that practice, that they themselves will get a visit? How are people fighting back against this?
Well, I think there's definitely that. And, self-censorship is a notoriously difficult thing to track because it's hard to know what people aren't saying and what they're afraid to say. But we do know that there has been enough, uprising and uproar about this, at least in the UK, that police have started to suggest that they might be approaching this differently. People who are high up in police leadership in London have said that they need to no longer be treated as the social media cops, and that, it's probably not the proper role of police to be weighing in these, disputes over offensive tweets. So I think we're at least seeing enough concern from the people that leadership is acknowledging that there's a problem, but how much reform will that ultimately lead to? That's obviously, reform doesn't always follow. So we're definitely keeping an eye on that.
How is it playing out politically? Like various parties, and has it become an election issue or a political issue in these countries? Because, I'm trying to put it in the Canadian context and how hopping mad I'd be if and maybe it is happening in Canada. Maybe we'll get into that in a bit. But how does it play out politically in these countries?
It's difficult because it's very difficult to find political parties that are really supportive of free expression, unfortunately. And I think each party tends to have their own, little sensitive issues that they're willing to openly endorse censorship of. In the UK, obviously, it's a political issue right now, but it's the political lines are messy because I think a lot of people are really unhappy about different kinds of policing and censorship. So, as we mentioned earlier, some points of view that people might consider more right wing. So speech about gender, speech about immigration, but also we've been seeing, a lot of concerns from people about censorship of pro-Palestinian speech in the UK. And also, something we haven't even touched on yet, the UK's Online Safety Act, which I think people kind of across the board are finding issues with. So it's messy and it's difficult, but it's something that we're going to have to wait and see how it plays out.
Are we seeing situations where people saying facts are getting targeted? It's one thing, the opinion and swear words about people. Okay, well, maybe someone say, okay, well, you are riling up hate with that. But are we seeing people get targeted for sharing something that many would consider a fact?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of speech that people find controversial and offensive is nevertheless based in fact. And, there has definitely been, people who have received police visits because of things they've posted about criminal activity or things they posted about immigration that, are controversial and, lead to unpleasant political conversations, but nevertheless may be true. And, sometimes, of course, there's, commentary added that is opinion based, but nevertheless is focusing on, existing issues that are part of the political debate.
Sarah, stick around, will you? Okay, I want to continue this conversation. I want to get into that Online Safety Act that you mentioned.
Absolutely.
And because I know in Canada, there's some push to have similar laws like that in this country. Continuing our discussion about free speech and censorship, particularly what's happening in Europe right now. Sarah McLaughlin's with us, senior scholar for global expression with the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. You know it as FIRE. Sarah, thanks for sticking around and continuing this conversation. I want to ask you a little bit about the American response and some American pressure on what's happening in Europe. It's not lost to me. I've seen this, the Undersecretary of State for Public Policy, Sarah B. Rogers. I've seen her Twitter account she goes hard after some of the stuff that's going on in Europe, some of the stuff you mentioned in the first half of this interview. What do you think about the American pressure on its quote unquote allies? I know everything's up in the air of late, but on European partners, allies, whatever you want to call them, when it comes to matters of free speech.
Well, so there's kind of two issues here. The first is that the U.S. is, especially people like Marco Rubio, they've been absolutely right to point out, and J.D. Vance have been right to point out that there are some serious free speech problems in Europe right now, and there is not much positive signs coming from Europe that there's going to be reform on that front. So the U.S. is right to point that out. But the other point here is that the U.S. is rapidly ceding its moral high ground on this issue, and we're reaching the point now where people might ask, "Why should I care what J.D. Vance thinks about free speech in Europe? He's got bigger issues here at home in the U.S." And so it's a really unfortunate thing because they're right to point out that this censorship in Europe is really bad for European democracies. It's bad for global free expression, but we also have a lot of issues within the U.S. It frankly seems to be growing worse by the day, and so it's hard, to imagine that the rest of the world is going to say, "Yeah, I'm going to listen to the United States on free speech right now."
Yeah, and in fact, I see the opposite effect. Like anything that comes out of this U.S. administration, doesn't matter what, European officials will, as a matter of fact, recoil on that front. You said things are getting worse in the States. I want to touch on that too. I don't want to throw all the shade on Europe here. What's happening in the States?
What isn't happening in the States right now? There's the way I've been describing it recently is an avalanche of First Amendment violations. So, here in the United States, we have the First Amendment to the Constitution, and that protects Americans' freedom of speech, and it limits what the government can do to censor us. But the flouting of that has been done by the Trump administration over what's now officially been a year of this presidency is shocking and incredible. Both on a legal standpoint and also a normative issue. It's pressure to fire Jimmy Kimmel, pressure on universities to silence speech the administration doesn't like. What we've been doing regarding immigration and free speech. Just recently, we've been telling Europe that they need to be better on free speech, but we also announced that we may start requiring visitors from Europe who are just here for a short vacation to hand over 5 years of social media history. It's disturbing, and exactly the kind of things that we're pointing out, this dystopian online surveillance state, we're only contributing to that if we tell people you need to hand over to the government 5 years of your tweets. It's sad because the world more than ever right now needs principled defenders of free speech, and we're not getting that right now in the United States.
Are you worried about, the examples that are being set and how others are following? Like in Canada, there's a big push from this government for what they call an online harms act. And it's always got a great name. All of these, you mentioned the efforts in Europe. It's always got a great name. Like, how could you possibly be against online safety acts, right? And then lo and behold, it has a chilling effect on speech and that. So I don't know if you've got a thought or two on what's happening in Canada and other countries that see these ideas on the legislation front and say, yeah, let's copy that.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the issue. We're seeing, countries look to what each other are doing when it comes to internet regulation and saying, sure, that sounds good. We care about kids. We want to protect kids. Let's do that too. But it's never just about protecting kids, and it always turns into censoring adults. And, there's a lot of discussion about people looking to the UK's Online Safety Act as some kind of model to follow. And very quickly what that law does is it forces social media companies to age gate material that may be, quote, harmful to children. Well, guess what? That's a lot of things. That's a very broad idea. And, if you look at, a lot of debates about what children should be reading, for example, people do not agree what's harmful to children as a preliminary matter. But so now the UK is even perhaps floating the idea of cracking down on VPN use from people who are trying to evade having to hand over their personal information just to get on Wikipedia. And so it's incredible. And, it never stops there. Next, maybe it's VPN use. And, banning VPNs is always a sign of authoritarianism. It's never a good path to go down.
Is anyone getting this right? Is there a country that's like, they're on the right path? Because it seems wherever I look, whether it's Australia or it's here at home in Canada, the Europe and the UK, I certainly don't think they're going down the right path. You bring up all the issues in the United States. Is anyone going down the right path here?
I believe the First Amendment is the right path. The issue is just the failure to follow it here in the United States. So I think we have the model, and I won't pretend that it's always easy. There's a lot of difficulty figuring out how these things all work in the internet age. But the First Amendment is still the right model, and ultimately, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's just about believing that the government is not always the arbiter of truth, and that it's not wise to give government the tools to decide what people can see or say or read. And that's what this is fundamentally about. Yeah,
and it just goes to that the example of, we're going to protect children, right? We're going to say what would be harmful to children? Well, who's making that decision? What if it's a panel, if it's a guy or woman in a cubicle who says, nope, they can't see that. Well, who's making that decision? Sarah, listen, we could go on and on. You've been very kind with your time. Thanks for coming on and talking about this with our listeners.
Thanks for having me.
That's Sarah McLaughlin there, Senior Scholar for Global Expression with the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. You also know it as FIRE.
I'm Dylan Playfair.
And I'm Tyler Smith.
We're putting loneliness in the penalty box by talking to some of our favorite athletes about the importance of friendship.
This is Bromance.
Bromance is brought to you by Charm Diamond Centers, proudly Canadian-owned and operated. Charm has been part of your love stories and bromances for over 50 years.
And you can find Bromance on the iHeartRadio network or wherever you get your podcasts.